Taste of Ashes, a prequel to Severance. Dawn of the Blade, Part 1. The first contagion, it started with the empaths. Dr. Sarah Chen was the first to document it properly, though others had noticed the pattern emerging for months. In her lab at the Neural Research Institute in Geneva, she watched the brain scans with growing unease. The subjects, 12 volunteers who'd reported unusual emotional transference after romantic encounters, showed identical abnormalities in their mirror neuron systems. It's like their boundaries dissolved, she told the review board. When they fell in love, they didn't just empathize with their partners. They began to literally share neurological patterns, memories, trauma, pain. The board was skeptical until Subject 1, a man named Marcus Okonkwo, had a complete psychotic break during a routine scan. His partner had survived childhood abuse, and when their connection deepened past a certain threshold, her trauma became his. He screamed for 40 minutes about things that had never happened to him, reliving her memories as if they were his own. By the time they sedated him, he'd clawed his own arms bloody, recreating scars his partner carried. The media called it cascade syndrome. Scientists called it neurological entanglement disorder. The religious called it proof that humanity had gone too far, that this was divine punishment for the breakdown of traditional values. Nobody called it what it was: evolution turning against itself. Part 2. The spread within 6 months. Cascade syndrome had been documented in 43 countries. The pattern was always the same. 2 people fell deeply in love, their neural pathways synchronized, and then the boundaries between self and other began to collapse. Memories transferred. Emotions leaked across the connection like water through a cracked dam. Trauma multiplied. The first murder-suicide happened in Tokyo. A young couple, both brilliant engineers, found themselves trapped in a feedback loop of each other's depression. They jumped from their apartment together, holding hands. The second happened in Buenos Aires, then Paris, then Lagos. The suicides were bad. The murders were worse. A man in Chicago killed his wife after experiencing her memories of a previous abusive relationship, not because she cheated, but because he couldn't separate her trauma from his own rage. A woman in Mumbai stabbed her husband 17 times after his memories of war, of things he'd done as a soldier, became hers. She told the police she was trying to kill the monster she'd seen in his mind. The psychiatric wards filled. The support groups grew. And still people fell in love, because how do you legislate the heart? Dr. Chen worked 18-hour days trying to understand the mechanism. It wasn't a virus or bacteria, nothing that could be quarantined or cured. It was something in human neurology itself that had changed, perhaps triggered by environmental factors, perhaps by the sheer density of human connection in the digital age. The brain's capacity for empathy, pushed to its limit, had broken through some fundamental barrier. "We're too connected," she wrote in her final paper before the government classified her research. "We evolved to love in small tribes, to know intimately only a handful of people. But now we're bombarded with the emotions of millions through screens, through constant connection. The brain adapted, and the adaptation is killing us. Part 3. The Cascade. By year 2, 20% of new romantic relationships resulted in cascade syndrome. The number kept climbing. Governments tried everything. Mandatory neural screenings before marriage licenses, counseling programs teaching emotional boundaries, medications that dulled the mirror neurons, turning people into functional sociopaths, just stable enough to work, but too numb to love. Nothing worked. If anything, the medications made it worse. People went off them to feel alive again. And when they fell in love, the crash was harder. The stories multiplied. A teacher in Seattle absorbed her boyfriend's memories of his daughter's death and walked into the ocean. A couple in Berlin became so entangled they could no longer remember which memories belonged to whom. They died of dehydration in their apartment, lost in each other's minds. A woman in Sao Paulo tasted her husband's infidelity through the connection, and in her rage and his guilt combined, burned their house down with both of them inside. The psychiatric term was shared psychosis. The street term was the merge. Those who survived the merge were never quite themselves again. They spoke in plural, we remember, instead of I remember. They moved in synchronization, finished each other's sentences, sometimes seemed to share thoughts without speaking. It was beautiful and horrifying in equal measure. Dr. Chen interviewed one such couple before they were separated by court order. "Don't you miss being yourself?" she asked. They looked at her with identical expressions of pity. "We are more ourselves than we ever were alone," they said in unison. 3 weeks after separation, they both killed themselves on the same day, at the same hour, in different cities. Part 4. The legislation. The Shanghai Accord was proposed in year 3, after cascade syndrome had been documented in 68% of new romantic relationships worldwide. The statistics were undeniable. Love had become a public health crisis. The proposal was simple and monstrous. Criminalize romantic love, not marriage that could continue for practical purposes, for raising children, for economic stability. Not sex that could be licensed and regulated, but love, the deep emotional entanglement that triggered cascade syndrome, would become illegal. The debates raged for months. Religious leaders argued both sides, some saying this was humanity's test, others that love was sacred and could not be outlawed. Philosophers questioned whether enforced isolation was worse than the alternative. Civil rights activists called it the greatest human rights violation in history. But the bodies kept piling up. A famous case tipped the scales: the Alvarez Kim family in Los Angeles. Parents who'd merged, 3 children caught in the emotional crossfire. When the parents' shared depression spiraled, they took all 5 lives in a murder-suicide pact. The children's last social media posts showed their own confusion. "I feel what mom feels," the oldest wrote. "I don't know where I end anymore." The images of those children's faces were broadcast worldwide. The vote happened 3 days later. The Shanghai Accord passed with 73% approval. Love became illegal. Part 5. The enforcement at first, they tried to be humane about it. Chemical castration of the mirror neurons became mandatory at age 14. Regular neural scans to detect early signs of emotional entanglement. Couples who showed the precursor patterns were separated and given therapy, then suppressants, then institutionalization if necessary. Dating was still allowed, but monitored. Apps now included neural tracking if your emotional baseline started synchronizing with someone else's. You received a warning. 3 warnings, and you were flagged for intervention. Marriage became a business contract with mandatory emotional distance protocols. Sex was permitted, but required pre-approved pharmaceutical dampening to prevent attachment. Children were raised in communal centers where they could bond with many caregivers, but attach deeply to none. It worked after a fashion. Cascade syndrome rates dropped to 12%, then 8, then 5. But humanity began to hollow out. Suicide rates tripled, not from cascade syndrome, from sheer emptiness. People described feeling like ghosts, going through motions of life without any of the color. Art suffered. Music became mechanical. Poetry died almost overnight. Who could write about love when feeling it meant imprisonment? Dr. Chen, now working for the Global Compliance Bureau, watched the data with growing horror. They'd stopped one crisis by creating another. We're not dying from merged trauma anymore, she told the Oversight Committee. We're dying from isolation, from the absence of connection. We've made ourselves safe by making ourselves nothing. The committee filed her report and did nothing. Part 6. The resistance, the underground, started small. Support groups for people who'd loved before the accord, who remembered what connection felt like. They met in basements and abandoned buildings, sharing stories like contraband. Then came the romantics. They were young, mostly people who'd grown up under the accord and had only read about love in banned books, seen it in old movies shown in secret screenings. They thought love was worth the risk, worth dying for even. The first public demonstration happened in Prague. 200 young people gathered in the square, holding hands, chanting poems, daring the authorities to stop them. Riot police broke it up within an hour. 43 were arrested and sent to neural reconditioning facilities. But the movement spread. In Paris, couples kissed publicly and refused to separate. In Tokyo, a group of artists staged emotion exhibitions where they shared their feelings openly, illegally. In New York, someone hacked the billboard systems to display love letters, real ones, from before the accord, when people could still write such things. The government cracked down harder. Mandatory reporting of suspicious emotional attachment. Rewards for turning in romantics. Neural scanners on every street corner. Children encouraged to report their parents if they seemed too close. The world began to look like a prison. Dr. Chen watched it happen and remembered the couples she'd studied in the early days, the ones who'd merged and lost themselves, but also, briefly, found something transcendent. She thought about Subject 7, Marcus, who'd screamed with his partner's pain. She'd spoken to him before he was institutionalized. Was it worth it, she'd asked, knowing what would happen? He'd looked at her with eyes that held 2 lifetimes of memory and said, Yes. God help me, yes. Because for a little while I wasn't alone. Part 7. The breaking point. The tipping point came in year 7 of the Accord. A group of scientists, working in secret, published a paper demonstrating that humans raised without deep emotional attachment showed decreased cognitive function, impaired problem solving, and accelerated neurological decay. The human brain, it turned out, needed love like it needed sleep. Deprive it long enough, and it broke down. The paper was immediately classified, the scientists arrested. But it was too late. The data had spread, and people began to ask the question that authorities had been dreading. If love is killing us, but the absence of love is also killing us, what the fuck are we supposed to do? The answer came from an unexpected place. A former patient of Dr. Chen's, a woman named Yuki Tanaka, who'd survived Cascade syndrome through careful neural therapy, proposed a solution: controlled connection. If people could be taught to love mindfully, to maintain boundaries, even in deep attachment, perhaps they could have connection without complete merger. We're not trying to stop people from drinking water, Yuki argued in a viral video that got her arrested within hours. We're trying to stop them from drowning. The solution isn't to ban water. It's to teach them to swim. The movement that formed around her ideas called itself the Swimmers. Part 8. The fall the world didn't end with a bang. It ended with a choice. After 8 years of the Accord, humanity had become something unrecognizable. Birth rates had collapsed. Who wanted to bring children into a world without love? Suicide rates had reached levels that threatened basic infrastructure. Whole cities had gone dark as people simply gave up. The resistance grew bolder, more desperate. Romantic cells formed everywhere, people choosing to risk the merge rather than live in gray emptiness. The prisons overflowed. The mental institutions ran out of space. And then the guards started letting prisoners go. Not officially, not as policy, but one by one, the people tasked with enforcing the Accord looked at what they were enforcing and walked away. A guard in Berlin, a neural scanner operator in Mumbai, a compliance officer in Chicago who'd spent 5 years separating families and finally couldn't do it anymore. The Shanghai Accord began to crumble not from revolution, but from mass abandonment. Dr. Chen was in her office at the Global Compliance Bureau when she got the call. The entire neural monitoring network in North America had gone offline. Not hacked, the operators had simply stopped showing up for work. She looked at the blank screens, the silent alarms, and felt something she hadn't felt in 8 years: relief. Finally, she whispered. By the end of the month, the Accord was effectively dead. Governments tried to maintain it, but you can't enforce a law when no one will enforce it. The world watched as young people flooded into the streets, holding hands, kissing, daring to feel again. Some of them would merge. Some of them would die from it. But they'd made their choice. Epilogue. After the fall, the historians would later call it the decade of empty hearts, those years when humanity tried to save itself by cutting out what made it human. Dr. Chen lived to see the aftermath, the careful reconstruction, the new therapies that helped people love without losing themselves entirely, the support systems for those who did merge, helping them maintain individual identity, even in connection. It wasn't perfect. People still died from cascade syndrome, but they also died from car accidents, from disease, from 1,000 other risks inherent in being alive and choosing to live fully. She was 93 when she gave her last interview for a documentary about the Accord years. "Do you regret it?" the interviewer asked. "Your early research. Some say you started this whole crisis." Dr. Chen thought about it for a long time. "I documented something that was already happening," she said finally. "The crisis was that we didn't know how to handle it. We panicked. We chose safety over humanity, and we learned that lesson too. You can't save people by making them stop being people." "What would you say to those who still think love should be regulated?" "I'd say they're afraid, and I understand that. Love is terrifying. It can destroy you, but so can its absence. So can living in a world where no one is allowed to care deeply about anything." She smiled, tired but genuine. "We're messy creatures, we humans. We hurt each other and ourselves. But we also heal each other, connect each other, save each other sometimes. You can't have one without risking the other." "Do you think humanity learned its lesson?" Dr. Chen laughed, dry and rasping. "Humanity never learns its lessons. We just keep making new mistakes. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the trying is what matters." She died 3 months later. At her funeral, her 3 children raised during the Accord years, in separate communal facilities, trained from birth to maintain emotional distance, held each other, and cried. They'd spent their adult lives learning to love despite their upbringing, learning to risk connection despite knowing the cost. They'd never asked their mother if it was worth it, but standing together, grieving together, feeling the terrible, beautiful weight of loss that only comes from having loved something, they thought they understood her answer. Yes, always yes. The world didn't end when they made love illegal. It ended when we tried to live without it. Epitaph on the memorial to the decade of Empty Hearts Shanghai, 2089.